Hello everyone, you are on the Gracie Manhwa YouTube channel. Thanks for subscribing and liking. I wish you a pleasant viewing. Love you. The main character named John tremblingly holds a paper in his hand with tests of his brain. He stands there, goosebumps running down his body, and sweat dripping from his forehead. The doctor, sitting on a chair, tells him that it is better to try to heal than to do nothing, but it is clear that these words do not give John faith. He is in complete shock, loses the paper with the tests from his hands. John stands and stares at the doctor, wondering how he's going to get on with this disease. Our main character is sitting in the park near the hospital and talking with his mother. She asks him how the examination went and if there is nothing serious there. He is sitting in complete confusion on the bench, says that everything is fine, just a little low blood sugar and that it is quite normal, but it is clear that he is terribly worried and in complete confusion. After he talked to his mother, apparently she passed the phone to his sister and she asks him about when he has a vacation because he missed her a lot. He, looking at a dead fly on the wet asphalt, answers him that he also missed him very much and will come tomorrow. Immediately, a happy father says into the phone that they will buy fish and tomorrow his mother will cook it, and in a happy voice informs him that tomorrow he will come for him. Coldly enough, he says okay, got it to his father, while he thinks about how he didn't even think about telling his family about the bad news. John says that he has to get on the bus to get to the dorm, his parents are worried about him and say that he should be careful, and his sister says goodbye to him. The main character hangs up the phone and sits in complete disbelief. What should he do next with his life? John starts to get very angry. It is clear that he is in a terrible state. It shows that inside he is aggressive and confused, he is angry and beats his fists on his legs. After that, he sits and holds his head with his hand. He has tears, mixed with the rain, and is terribly upset and sits there with complete incomprehension as to why death chose him out of so many people on earth. The little sister looks up at the sky and closes one eye as a drop of rain falls on her. She tells Dad that it's going to rain soon, and Mom picks up the conversation and says we can go home now that they've already bought everything. A passerby sitting in the restaurant sees a family wandering around the market at the moment when it starts to rain. He comes out of the store and shouts to John's father that they should go into the store, take shelter, and enjoy the short rain from there. The father answers him that even if you sit in this cafe, you can still get sick, so they better go home and not get sick, because it really starts to rain quite heavily and you can easily get sick. A passerby standing at the exit of the cafe accepted the decision of Papa John, and a little advertising this institution says that the food there is simply excellent, while the people who eat in this cafe are talking at it. With a smile on his face, he walks back in, although he has a smile on his face, but you can still see that he is slightly displeased and finds John's family a little boring. He sits down at his table and asks the chef to bring him supplements. Apparently the restaurant really does have delicious food, since he already takes more than one portion. The chef answers him that he accepted the order. He continues to eat rice and meat for lunch. His expression shows that he liked the food very much and he insatiably eats on, saying how incomparable it is. He has veins on his forehead and is sweating a little. At this moment, in the kitchen, the chef kills the animal, apparently for the dish. Blood gushes. The boss talks to a woman, apparently his wife or girlfriend. She tells him that things have been going great lately and that everything is in order with them. The dialogue continues and the boss says that it remains only to close the debt. At this moment, apparently the animal does not really want to become a dish and bites the person who decided to kill him. The chef cries out in pain. He looks at his bloody hand because of the bite. It is clear that he is not happy. Of course, he was bitten quite badly by an animal and the whole finger is now covered in blood, after the bite. Sweat runs down his face and he decides to stop the blood with his mouth, so that it will somehow stop. Meanwhile, John has started to bleed and his girlfriend, wiping the blood, asks if everything is all right with him. Apparently she is worried, but on the other hand, she does not mind making fun of him and says that maybe he is thinking about some vulgarities. In front of the bus itself, she asks him if he got caught in the rain yesterday. She wipes away the blood, still sneering at him, whether he's thinking about something erotic or maybe about her. He looks tired and asks her to calm down. Sweat drips down John's forehead and he closes his eyes. In fact, he was thinking back to his conversation with the doctor yesterday and wondering why his nose was bleeding so often. In his head, he thinks that if he didn't have brain cancer, he would get close to this girl. It is clear that he cares about her. They get on the bus and the guys who pick it up get in behind it, and one of them is standing right behind it. The impudent man grabs John by the shoulder and jerks him to the side with a sharp push. Our main character falls to the floor and, dissatisfied with this situation, says that this is a dog club that humiliates him at the end of each semester. The main character's girlfriend throws herself at Tim, who did a very bad thing with John, but Tim tells her that he doesn't like the way she does and why is she even protecting him. Tim's sixes start shouting in a joyful voice that she would continue to protect her husband. From the girl's side, it looked terrible. She very boldly replies to him that it is better to be his wife than his and repels the hand that Tim wanted to touch her with. Tim's sixes say that she stands up for this sucker every time, and Tim asks not to interfere because it's not her business, in his opinion. The boys also get on his nerves that he doesn't deserve to be called a man, but it's not John's fault that he was born with poor health and body. John holds back his aggression and clenches his fists, which are already showing beads of sweat. It is clear that this company mocks him, insults him, and humiliates him from year to year, and he cannot fight them back. A cool-looking Tim walks past John, who is sitting on the floor, and John thinks to himself at this moment how much Tim is boring him and how annoying he is. John seems to have gathered his strength. He is tired of putting up with this, and he wants to stop all this bullying. John gives Tim a very angry look and can't help but think that he won't be long after all. He grabs him roughly by the cheekbones, and John is completely taken aback. Tim holds it up threateningly. John can no longer contain his aggression and snaps at Tim with angry eyes. From Tim's look, it is clear that he is very dissatisfied with John's actions and wants to do something unpleasant. He takes it and throws the angry hero to the floor with all his strength, so much so that John falls headfirst on the floor, and the phone flies out of his pocket. The phone falls out of your pocket and shatters. We are shown the hospital, the city where the main characters live. The news reports say that people went completely crazy after eating game in a restaurant in the market. Clearly something is wrong with this restaurant. The father is worried about his son. He does not understand why he does not answer his calls, but the mother at this moment wants the father to stop calling and just send a text message, because the son is just going home. The father is perplexed and does not understand why his brother suddenly became so aggressive. Loud screams are heard, and he recently had lunch in the same restaurant. The doctors are trying to calm him down, but you can see that this is not working well. The person is incredibly aggressive, the veins on his forehead have popped out and he behaves very incomprehensibly. The father is worried about his brother and says that the only thing they can do is stay there. The mother decided to ask what he was ill with. The doctor is perplexed and does not know what to answer specifically, because he saw a lot of people with similar diseases in a few days. The father stands there in complete shock and has absolutely no idea what's going on. We have shown a place with a name, and you can hear some sounds there. Now everything becomes clear. Residents of the city are bursting into these establishments and waiting for explanations from the chief, why after their relatives ate there they went to the hospital with an unknown disease. One of the people is angry and starts to break down the door with something heavy, shouting in anger that he would open it. The crowd shouts in anger and breaks into the restaurant. After they broke down the door, they saw blood and flies all over the place. Something strange happened inside. Tables are overturned, the interior is a mess, everything is broken, there is blood everywhere. They decided to go inside, and there they were waiting for a terrible stench, people in complete ignorance of what could smell like that. They all look at the door inside the cafe together. There are sounds coming from there, as if someone is eating. Absolutely all people have an absolute misunderstanding. A man from the crowd still overcame his fear and decided to go check out what was going on there, because everyone is interested. Just a second later, he cries out in horror. We are shown a terrifying picture where someone is devouring a person with terrifying sounds. Everything is covered in blood and there is a terrible smell of rotten meat. A dead man is lying. Apparently he died a long time ago due to his condition. Flies are flying around and they are mercilessly devouring him. We are transported to the bus in which the main character John is traveling. From there we hear shouts that Tim would have beaten John harder and already got rid of him. With all his strength, he punches John in the face, causing the main character's nose to bleed. Tim grabs him by the shirt and tells him with a horrified look that how dare he bother him. John is in a very bad state and can't do anything anymore. John's friend, Casey, decided to stand up and started to get into a dialogue. Because she doesn't like everything that is happening now, she shouts at them to get behind, but they tell her that this is a man's showdown and the boss is just teaching him a lesson. Her eyes are filled with anger. She wrings the hand of one of the offenders. He starts screaming in pain. He clearly did not expect this. He starts to apologize, begging for mercy, but Casey wrings him more and more, and I think it's the least he deserves. The driver is extremely dissatisfied with the situation that is happening in his cabin and asks everyone to calm down, because it is very distracting. At one unexpected moment, the bus driver does not notice the person and knocks him down. Along with this, the windshield is broken. Apparently the impact was strong. The driver slams on the brakes. All the people in the cabin are in complete shock and they are thrown from side to side, from such a blow. Casey tries to hold on to the passenger seat, but it's obvious that she needs a lot of strength to do so. After stopping, the driver immediately jumps out of the cabin and goes to see what's in the end: blood on the front of the car and a broken windshield, everything that can be seen. One of the six, Tim, yells out of the window at the driver with complete discontent, and the driver is still standing in shock near the bus and absolutely does not understand how this could have happened. Tim is shouting from somewhere on the bus about what the driver is doing, and it's clear that everyone is unhappy with what happened. John tried to hit Tim, but it was really bad, and he hit him just a little bit. He looked at him with an evil look. Jack looks him in the eye and breathes heavily, blood dripping from his nose. Tim laughed and looked into the protagonist's eyes with a nervous grin, urging him to look at this dog that was still struggling. Raising his hand to strike, Tim wants to deliver a decisive blow. A sharp knock on the window, a bloody hand with claws is visible on the surface of the glass. Tim, taken aback, couldn't finish the punch, and looked at the picture in front of him. Noticing the people inside, the zombies started shouting more actively. Casey and Tim were startled, sweat running down their faces. A man sitting on the ground looks like a zombie hanging on the bus and looks at the people inside the bus. The zombie noticed the victim near the bus and turned its attention to more accessible prey. Jumping off the bus, the zombie pounced on the man and knocked him to the ground, digging its sharp teeth into the man's shoulder, starting to eat him. From what they saw, people on the bus were horrified and jumped out of their seats, shouted zombies who began to run away, and someone stood rooted to the spot and just looked at what was happening. Tim reacted quickly and ran to the driver's seat. Tim got behind the wheel and turned the key in the ignition. Tim slams on the gas, pushing down hard on the floor. The bus takes off and drives the right wheel over the zombie and the man, crushing the zombie's head so that he definitely did not survive. Slightly slowing down, the speed of the bus goes further along the road, taking passengers further away from the scene of the accident. In the rearview mirror, you can see the silhouettes of two bodies and the trail of blood left by the wheel of this bus. Tim looks in the mirror and thinks that they've been blown away and need to get back to town. A sharp yell from a passenger who is scared to death tells the guy to look ahead. Tim looks ahead and is horrified, and a small drop of sweat drips down from his temple. In front of Tim, who is sitting behind the wheel in the driver's seat, the zombie's head smashes the windshield and the head gets inside the bus. In front of Tim's eyes, the zombie's mouth is open, its tongue hanging out, and its teeth are sharp. Squeezing into the chair, Tim looks at the picture in front of him, and now he is sure for himself that there is a zombie in front of him. Turning the steering wheel sharply to the left, the car makes a sharp turn and the zombie begins to fly off the windshield. Catching on the wipers, the zombie does not fly away on the road, but begins to climb into the bus. The zombie starts to climb through the broken glass and reaches its claws towards Tim's stunned face. After Casey's rapier wound, the zombie falls into the interior of the bus, immobilized. Shocked by what is happening, Tim turns back to find out who struck the blow. Casey stands ready, rapier held in front of him, and the shocked faces of the passengers can be seen from behind. Casey kicks the zombie's body out of the open doors of the bus, which is traveling at a decent speed. The bus just skips through the checkpoint at high speed. John sits in a lotus position on the floor of the bus and stares at the screen of the phone he's holding in front of him, the panicked screams of passengers coming from behind him. John stares at the broken screen and his only thoughts are that his loved ones were all right. Tim's face was covered in blood and showed annoyance at what was happening in the cabin. A small checkpoint booth was visible in the side rearview mirror. The bus pulls into a deserted stop, and inside the bus, people rejoice at their arrival. People slowly began to get off the bus to the stop where there was not a single soul. Tim was the first to get off the bus and start looking around, and behind him the passengers got off more slowly and started talking about why is it so quiet. Casey was getting off the bus, holding Jack's arm and walking a little behind him. Someone in the crowd of passengers shouted, "Look," pointing with his index finger in front of him. Through the glass doors, a crowd of people could be seen in a blur. Someone was squatting on the floor in a crowd of people and holding their head. Having cheered up the same one, the passenger began to cheerfully shout, "People. Real people." He took off running toward that crowd of people, and the first glass doors opened to let him pass, and Tim looked on and tried to stop him with words. Putting his hand on the man's shoulder, the passenger said, "You won't believe what happened to us. We just..." The woman turns around with a terrible look, with red eyes. A passerby does not believe his eyes, looks in horror at the woman. Later, he notices that there is not one female zombie standing in front of him, but a huge crowd of similar monsters. But it's too late, he can't do anything and is attacked by several inhumans, one of whom drives his fangs into his shoulder. The loud cry of terror he lets out spreads to the entire street, causing all the people to panic. Casey grabs John's arm, trying to get him as far away from the zombies as possible. Everything could work out, but the zombie's hand is already reaching out to her neck to grab her and tear her apart. Just a little more and he would have succeeded, but John manages to push her off, thereby saving her from the attack. Due to his attempt to help, John falls to the ground, hitting the car hard, thus leaving him in a very dangerous situation. Casey knows she can't do nothing, or they'll die, so she quickly pulls her sword out of her bag. John sits exhausted, the only thing he can do right now is watch. Without a second's hesitation, his girlfriend points her sword towards the zombie with great force and wounds his arm. John is very surprised by something, and his gaze is not directed in Casey's direction. He sees a red car in front of him, with his toy in the back seat. John decides to move, but with great care, so as not to fall into the eyes of one of the zombies. The front door of the red car is open. John is very happy about this and calls his mom and dad, hoping to see them inside. But when he gets a little closer, he sees the empty interior of the car, clearly disappointed. A surprised look is directed at the car seat, and John sees something on it. It was a phone with the screen turned on. He picks it up and before his eyes opens a correspondence with his father, in which the last message in plain text was a call to escape. John's eyes fill with tears, and he's shaking all over. He is overwhelmed with emotion, but unable to contain it, he shouts "Daddy" loudly, still holding the forgotten phone tightly in his hand. Unexpectedly, a childish hand grabs his t-shirt. John turns around and looks through his tears at the back of the car. All this time his younger sister was sitting there, scared and all in tears. She says, "Little brother." When he sees her, he starts crying even harder. John is overjoyed to see his sister alive and reaches out to give her a hug and comfort her, while she tells him that their parents are gone and haven't returned. They hug tightly, John stroking his sister's head. She is still crying and asks her little brother how he managed to get back. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a zombie tries to attack them. It breaks the glass in the car, fragments of which fly directly in their direction. The zombie begins to reach out to them, already climbing part of its torso into the car through the broken window. It would seem that there is not much left, but Casey appears, who is able to knock the monster to the ground. Her gaze is directed directly at the zombie, holding a sword in her hands. She swings it. The point of the sword at the same time pierces the monster lying on the road through. John is dumbfounded by the whole picture, looking at the beautiful and fearless Casey standing in the sunset, holding the sword that saved their lives. Casey walks over to the car and reaches out to John, who has been hugging his sister tightly all this time. There are drops of blood on their savior's face and white t-shirt, and she calls John and her little sister to come with her. They didn't refuse and ran at a fast pace towards her. They are in a hurry, so John picks up his little sister and runs for cover. Casey knows they won't be able to escape at this rate, so she pushes John in the right direction. They all manage to crawl together into the closing garage. At the same time, the garage closes with a bang, creating a safe place for them to hide from the zombies. John looks towards the door with a very tired look, and lets out a sigh. Two guys are looking at them and they also look tired and disheveled. With them in the shelter were many people who began to discuss the whole horror that had happened. The zombies intend to break the glass by getting inside, and the blonde gets the idea to send someone to the zombies, thereby distracting them so that the rest of the people can escape to a safer place. Outraged shouts are immediately directed in his direction, because no one wants to die and sacrifice themselves to save others. Since no one wants to volunteer, the blonde chooses who he will send to certain death and grabs the hand of his little sister John. Naturally, Casey and John were very much outraged by this and were against his actions. But the blonde doesn't pay any attention to it, just like his entourage, they are going to do something intentional. The poor girl is crying loudly and begging to be released. John responds to her cry for help, pushes the people who were hindering him and runs to save his sister. The blonde scoffs at what is happening and offers to go out to Zombie John, if he so badly wants them to let his little sister go. The taunt doesn't end there, the blonde kicks John in the face and tells him that he's going to die with his sister. John fell to the floor, clutching his head in pain. Out of the corner of his eye, the blonde saw danger. A sword was aimed at him, but he reacted quickly and was able to avoid the attack with a large wooden stick. It was a disgruntled Casey who wasn't going to stand. Their eyes met, and Casey told them to let the baby go immediately. The blonde pushed the little girl and told his friend to hold her down so that she wouldn't run away. The first blow was delivered by the blonde man, but Casey managed to stop him with her sword. The man advises her to give up before it's too late. While everyone is distracted by the fight, one guy offers to take advantage of the moment and quietly throw the girl out into the street, but the girl starts screaming. Other people just look at her in silence, but they are not going to help her in any way. Meanwhile, lying on the floor, John begins to regain consciousness and call out for his sister. He still can't get up, his mind filled with the bad results of his tests. John sees a pleasant and warm memory where their family is all together, they clearly look happy. He remembers the doctor telling him not to give up, because it's better than doing nothing. John is very worried, and there are questions in his head that make him cry. Remembering the current situation, he becomes powerless. John is gaining strength, his body trembling, but he still crawls towards his little sister. As soon as she saw him, she immediately started calling for her brother, hoping that he would save her. John shouts loudly that he is ready to go instead of her, but in his heart he understands that he does not want to do this at all. Surprised looks were directed in his direction. Casey was the most surprised of all. John knows he has to do this to save his sister, and his body trembles as he gets to his feet. In a confident tone, he tells me to let my sister go, insists that he can become a bait for zombies. He still manages to convince everyone and bring his sister back, he takes her in his arms. John calms her down, promising that everything will be fine and she doesn't have to worry. He tells her that he will find mom and dad and will definitely come back. But the girl doesn't want him to leave and leave her. John pushes his sister away from him and tells Casey to take good care of her. Casey disagrees with John's decision to become a decoy and tries to persuade him. But John silences her by touching his index finger to her lips. He brings his finger to his lips, telling them not to say another word, because they won't be able to convince him otherwise. Finally, John hugs Casey and his sister and tells them that he loves them. Casey looks at him with worried eyes. John grabs his sister's hand and tells her to always listen to Casey from now on. He turns away from them and walks slowly towards the exit. His little sister cries in the wake. Guys who wanted to throw out his sister to the zombies accompany him with shouts that he would go and get lost. The blonde looks at John with a very stern look. John just looked at him, unperturbed. The blonde guy opens the door wide for John. John crosses the threshold and is met by a crowd of monsters who will soon pay attention to him. Casey throws a sword at John to give him something to defend himself with. John catches it and holds it tightly in his hand. The sword gives him confidence. John directs his gaze in the direction of a large number of zombies. Standing up against a crowd of monsters, he tells himself that they're bound to come back. John begins to defend himself from the zombies by swinging his sword, blood splattering everywhere. John was able to eliminate several zombies, but there are still a lot of monsters that intend to attack him. His business is bad. He does not have the opportunity to take a break. Fighting off one zombie immediately climbs the next. Another monster that was once a human falls on the corpses of zombies lying on the road. John's sword is warped by too many blows and will soon become unusable. He decides to run away from the zombies for a short distance. The ugly creatures begin to scream angrily and follow John. John feels a strong hatred for them and looks at them with disgust. One of the monsters has its back to him. Taking the chance, John points his sword at him. The zombie turns around and looks directly at John with red eyes. John is taken aback by this, and the zombie's gaze looks familiar. It was his father who had turned into a zombie. But it was no longer his father who stood before him, but a monster with greenish skin and teeth, which can easily bite off human flesh. John couldn't help but cry and move as the zombies slowly came closer and closer. He becomes easy prey and the zombies pounce on him. John does not resist and lets the zombie pierce his neck with its fangs. Other monsters also want to bite him and pounce, causing the main character to fall to the ground. He cries and remembers the image of his mother. This image of Beak corresponded to a zombie that had bitten off part of his flesh. John gritted his teeth in pain, tears and sweat mixing on his face. The zombies that used to give birth to him continue to bite off his body, piece by piece. Lying in a pool of blood, John hugs his former parents to her. He screams, denying what is happening, does not want to put up with all this. Tears trickle down his cheek as he realizes that his parents are right in front of him. The zombie's hand is reaching for his eyes, just a little more and the sharp claws will sink right into him. That's exactly what happened, and John is lying exhausted in his own pool of blood. Everyone in the room is watching, and Casey tries to close the little girl's eyes, but it's very difficult for her to contain her emotions. John's strength is failing, he can no longer hold the sword in his hands, it just lies next to his hand. Casey screams pitifully and shouts for John with tears in her eyes. To the human body, even more zombies begin to approach, who are eager to eat. The worst day in China has ended, with vultures circling in the sky. They do not leave the corpse without attention and finish the remaining meat after the zombie. One vulture flies straight towards John with the same intent. Before landing, the bird already puts out its claws to start tearing the skin and meat. Her beak moves closer to John's pale, almost blue corpse. The vulture is already ready to rip his skin off. But then John grabs the bird by the neck, robbing it of its lunch. He looks at the bird with a disdainful look, his eyes reddened. John had the strength to stand up. He bites the bird's neck with his sharp teeth, preventing it from moving because of its strong grip. A spray of blood almost hit him in the eye. He loosens his grip and throws the already dead vulture to the ground. The bird's blood makes John vomit, and he doesn't like it. All the zombies immediately turn around, and even from their faces you can tell that they are surprised. John gets to his feet. His hair was longer and his body stronger, his fingernails longer, but his eye was still human. John has only one eye left working, and he wonders what happened to me? He looks up in disbelief. John sees a black and white sky in front of him. The clouds turned gray for him. Zombie clothing is also in shades of gray. Turning his attention back to the zombies, he comes to his sense. John begins to remember what happened and how it happened in the first place. He realizes that he was eaten by zombies. But John still can't understand how this is possible, because he was eaten by zombies, but he's still alive. He starts to go and think about how it happened. John remembers being inactive while being bitten by zombies. Casey and his younger sister, who saw his brother being killed by monsters, come to mind. It occurs to John that they need to be found immediately. He ran towards the shelter where all the people should be hiding. But what the saw horrified him. The shop was destroyed, and there were traces of blood everywhere. John calls his loved ones by name, hoping that they will respond. A sound caught his attention and he looked in that direction. In front of him was a fat zombie that was eating someone's flesh. Terrified, John didn't want to believe with his own eyes that the zombies were able to get inside the store. As he stood there, a zombie reached out to bite his leg. Sharp teeth pierced John's leg. But John didn't seem to feel it as he headed towards the other zombie. This monster sat with its back to him, ignoring him. John was shaking from what he saw. The zombie was wearing a blindfold. The familiar armband that belonged to Casey. John was horrified by this, but his terror turned to anger and rage, so he pounced on the zombies. The other monster that bit his legs had its teeth broken due to a very quickly healed wound. John yells at the zombie that ate Casey. John wishes they could have eaten it together. He calls out to his little sister. He's filled with anger. With his bare hands, John tears open the zombie's skin, from which a fountain of blood gushes. His enraged gaze is directed directly at the monster. John swings to hit the zombie. With his punch, he breaks all the zombie's teeth and puts his hand in the zombie's mouth. John pushes his hand even further, telling the monster to return Casey's blind to him. With all his strength, he pulls his arm out, along with the zombie armband. The floor is covered in blood. From such a zombie falls. John holds tight to Casey's pink, blood-stained bandage that she used to put on her leg. He was sweating and breathing heavily. In incomprehension, he asks the question, "Am I really a zombie?" John's attention is drawn to the sound that comes from the boxes in the corner of the room. He ventures closer to them. Pushing them away, John was surprised. He saw a very scared guy. John called him by his first name. The guy got scared when he saw John and started shouting "zombie." John heard that the zombies were very close to them and it was dangerous. The zombies tried to get close to them, falling on the cabinet, which caused water bottles to fall on them. The guy was terrified. But John was not afraid, swung in the direction of the zombie. With one hit, he was able to eliminate 2 zombies that wanted to eat them. John's eyes were blank. The guy recognized John and called out to him. John looked in his direction. But the guy was terrified. At the same time, he is attacked by a zombie. It bit him on the neck, and the last thing he managed to say as he looked in Jonah's direction was "monster." Aaron's dead hand pointing at nothing and John standing in the shadows as if paralyzed. All wet with water and smeared with the blood of the murdered Aaron. John is shocked by what he's heard. The meaning of Aaron's now dead words dawns on John. Aaron's hand lies in a pool of blood that mixes with the pool of water on the asphalt. The main character takes a step, but his legs are like cotton wool, he can barely stand on his feet. John's legs buckled, and he fell to his knees on the asphalt, and he began to understand the meaning of the corpse's words. John stares at his reflection, which he sees in a pool of water with blood, and understands. He was just called a monster. Figures of people sitting in blood against the background of a scarlet sunset. The shocked reflection of John's face in a pool of water mixed with blood shows the complete confusion of becoming a zombie. He notices the zombie, which furiously continues to eat Aaron's defenseless body. John looks at the zombie, drawing an analogy with himself, and realizes that he is not just a zombie, but a monster. Aaron's face is frozen in a grimace of silent screams, and his glassy, no longer alive eyes see John's reflection in them. John exhales a sharp "ha," realizing that it's not that bad yet. He can still think for now. A scream is heard from the supermarket, and the zombies instinctively turn in the direction of the scream. Holding his head in his hands, John screams at the top of his voice. Flying, cylindrical shape, iron stick. The iron stick flew all the way to his head and hit him squarely on the back of the head. The force of the blow causes John to lose consciousness, his eyes popping open. He's lying unconscious next to an iron stick. A group approaches, discussing how noisy the zombies are. Scott puts his foot on John's head and informs the others that he may already be dead. Michael broke up and smashed the head of one of the zombies with a homemade bat as the cattle descended to the unconscious body of the angry character. The cattle tied John's ankles together with an ordinary rope. Stock dusts off his hands after the work he's done and tells the others not to get carried away, otherwise they'll quickly run out of steam and be useless. Michael grabs John's bound legs. Michael drags the main character to the exit. A parked truck near a closed store. He threw John in the back of a parked car. The main character is lying on a pile of zombies, and someone reports that John is the last one. The cattle leave the room, the rest begin to gather because someone gave the command leave. The angry character lies unconscious with the rest of the zombies tied to the bumper of the truck. Scott slung the metal stick over his shoulder and grinned. Approaching the truck, Scott turned to the other guys and noticed that today's catch was excellent. The car took off and started to pick up a lot of speed. John's body took off and was dragged behind the car. After all the work done, the cattle allows themselves a little rest and rides in the car with their eyes closed and their arms crossed. While the main character is unconscious, moments from his life flash before his eyes. He remembers a time when he wasn't a zombie yet. John opens his eyes and doesn't know where he is. He sits down on the bed and looks around the room he's in. The main character looks into another room while calling his parents. He looked into the kitchen, and there was no one there, but there was an uncovered pot on the stove that gave off that nice smell. John went to the pot and decided to see what was so flavorful. A pot of tender-looking meat was being cooked, which would later turn into soup. The main character from the sight and smell involuntarily swallowed, only at one glance he wanted to eat. John stares into the pot with fascinated eyes, not taking his eyes off the meat. The hand itself, as if it lives its own life, reaches for the pot. Ignoring the fact that the broth in the pot is hot, John abruptly dips his hand right into the pot and grabs the meat. There are chunks of delicious meat in John's red-hot hands. His eyes became frantic, the pupils narrowed, and the color of his eyes darkened. John went berserk and started eating meat like an animal. A mother came into the room and looked at her son, who was sitting on his knees in front of the oven, and called out to him. John stopped eating the meat, not expecting to be called out, and started to turn to his mother. The main character's appearance was terrifying. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes wild, her eyes bloodshot, her claws like a predator's. He didn't look human. Mom, having seen all this picture, did not recognize her son in everything she saw and shouted zombie at the top of her voice. As if he had woken up, he came to his senses and felt sick from seeing the picture that appeared before him. The main character was disgusted. He took a little step back and couldn't come to his. His sister was covered in blood, saying little brother, and there was a huge pool of blood on her face, and the blood that was on his hands was also hers. Sweat broke out. John felt sick at the realization of his actions. He couldn't believe what he had just done. Unable to stand the surging emotions, the angry character shouted at the top of his voice. Moving away from the memories, John woke up, but at the same time shouting the name of his little sister. Grandfather holds herbs and seasoning in his hand, and the kid ladles and looks at the screaming angry character with very surprised eyes. John is soaking wet that he doesn't know what's going on. It's like being in a bathhouse. Grandpa and the kid were so frightened by the sight of John that Grandpa fell and dropped the leek from his hand, and he fell to the ground. The main character, standing naked, under the screams of his grandfather, looks around, as if assessing the situation, but he did not understand what kind of place it was. Looking down at the bottom, An is surprised at what is happening. John is standing in a tub filled with water, and there's a bonfire under the tub. They wanted to make soup out of it. All sorts of spices were floating in the water. Lots of leeks, onions and carrots. Yes, such a feeling through everything that was. John looked down at his hand and noticed that there were a lot of bows. In a literal sense, the whole hand was covered in pieces of onions. Hearing a loud roar, John looked up, startled. The zombies hung tied to the rafters, though they had makeshift gags, but it didn't stop them from growling. The angry character's mouth opens involuntarily at the sight of the picture, and he simply does not understand what is happening here. Some kind of abandoned building. It's obvious that no one has been here for a long time. Someone threw an inhaler, before calling out to be caught for sure. Even without looking in the direction of the flying inhaler, Scott easily caught it right in front of his face. Cattle stands with an inhaler in his hands, and behind him shouts rebellious guys with words that they used to give out $5 grand, but now only one. Fred stands with his arms crossed and looks down at the others, as if putting himself above them, and Leo pushes up his glasses and tells the crowd that the rules have changed. Fred then showed his snide smile, as if mocking. Of course, Michael is surrounded by Fred's guys, but the cattle are standing still, but Michael is already on edge, and suddenly Fred is already demanding 20 zombies from them, and Michael thinks this is a mean act. Standing to Fred's right, Leo starts looking at them from under his glasses, showing off his bright wheat-colored eyes and explaining that medicine is currently the most scarce resource, and if he doesn't save up, then even he won't get anything. Scott was already a little tired of this topic, standing and twirling his snow-white hair around his index finger. He smiled and asked them to stop lying. Fred looks at this picture in a burst of anger, and Scott is still standing with a slight smile on his face, closing his eyes, twirling a curl around his finger, and Fred asks lie, in bewilderment. Fred stood in a closed position while Scott put his iron pipe on his shoulder and told them that he had heard everything. Scott's face changed abruptly, becoming angry and giving off a sinister aura, and he said, "I know you're trying to trick us." This phrase brought Fred to his boiling point, almost breaking into a shout, "How dare you!" Scott, saying that he was already infuriated, took off from the spot and hit Fred with his pipe. Fred's men hadn't expected this turn of events. No one had ever dared to attack their boss before. Fred's men were startled by Scott's words, and one of them shouted, "Stay back." The whole team of Fred caught themselves and decided to call out to him, but no one could move. Everyone seemed to be standing around him, and Fred, as if slightly bent down, held his head with his hand, where the blow was struck, closer to the temple. Fred's rage skyrocketed, and Laz's eyes were bloodshot, and he said "pathetic puppy" through clenched teeth. Enraged, Fred swung back to strike, his eyes white, and he yelled "die" in the direction of the cattle as he prepared to strike. Fred's fist shot past the unruffled cattle, who made the incline without any trouble. Scott's hand snapped up and squeezed Fred's shoulder. Without any effort, Scott shoved Fred so hard that he fell face first to the floor. The brute, whose hair shadowed his eyes but one red eye was visible, swung his iron pipe at Fred, who was on all fours in front of him. Dark figures of cattle who completed a blow with an iron pipe to Fred's head on a red background. Fred and Leo's men stare in shock at Fred's unconscious falling body after being hit by cattle with a metal pipe dripping with blood. Out of breath, the cattle exhales, taking the medicine, and then says, "What a pity that I have asthma." After taking the medicine, Scott puts the pipe on his shoulder and notices, exhaling, that sometimes it even annoys him. Gas was poured on Fred's evil people, and they were perplexed. Scott, wiping his pipe on Michael's t-shirt while Michael is silent, turns to Fred's men and says to them, "Now we need to make a deal with you." One of Fred's men examined himself and sniffed the liquid, assuming it was gasoline. Scott stands over them, looking down, but their eyes are hidden by their hair, asking, "Did you think you could beat me?" and flanked by his company with open bottles dripping with leftover liquid. A matchbox and a match appear in Scott's hands, and he carefully lights the match. The match caught fire in the face of the cattle, who looked rather intimidating, and said goodbye to "time to make a barbecue out of you," to which Fred's men begged for mercy. In the sharply opened doorway, the figure of Grandpa in a hat who tried to cook John not so long ago appears, and he calls out to the boss. Fred's men sit motionless in fear as the cattle, match in hand, turn with a silent question in their grandfather's direction. The zombie's hand grabs his grandfather's head and drags him away before he can say anything but, "There are zombies." Scott's eyes showed that he was surprised as someone sighed in the background. John with a bare torso appeared instead of his grandfather and asks all the people in the room, "Who's in charge here?" Scott stood up in a tense pose, as if ready for anything, and looking at John, who was coming closer, thought to himself, "He's the same zombie." Scott's thoughts sent him into shock, sweat pouring down his temples, and he remembered putting his foot on John's head. A sudden flashback causes the match to fall out of Scott's hands, and Scott and Jen stare in silent fright at the flying match. Someone shouted, "Damn, there's gas here too," and John's eyes were focused on the falling match in the puddle of gas. Something passed close to the cattle, moving at an imperceptible speed to the eye, the wind ruffling the cattle's hair. Scott froze, looking ahead with his hair in disarray. Behind the motionless cattle, who simply couldn't imagine that what just happened was simply impossible, stood John after he quickly caught a match flying into the gasoline. Small embers and smoke are falling from John's clenched hand. John turns and looks at Scott's back and asks, "Can you explain yourself?" Scott slightly lowered his head down, covered his eyes with bangs, and thinks to himself that he is a complete zombie. Scott's hand tightened on the metal pipe, and it didn't matter that John, who was standing in front of him and looking at him with a question in his eyes, was special. Scott, having taken off from the place, set a goal for himself to knock down the angry character from his feet and raise the pipe for John standing in front of him. John easily stopped the metal pipe that was aimed at the head with his left hand. Looking up, John gripped the pipe effortlessly in his hand. A tense silence fell between John, who was holding the now broken pipe in his hand, and the cattle. The realization of what was happening came to Scott's mind, thinking to himself that he was fucked up, and he was disappointed. After the cattle pipe fell into disrepair, John threw it right on the floor and hit the concrete with a distinctive sound. A group of cattle was standing behind him, and only Michael decided to call out to him, a little afraid and stammering, "Boss." The two men stared at each other, Scott opposite John. John is standing in front of Scott, who curses, "Damn it." The main character looks ahead with a straight face and makes a remark, "Hey, I actually asked a question." John is surprised by the cattle plummeting to the floor. The cattle fell to the floor, crouching at the feet of the angry character and shouting, "Don't kill." John is surprised by Scott's actions and doesn't understand what's going on. The cattle cry out as if begging for mercy, "I shouldn't have stolen you. I made a mistake," while the angry character calmly approaches him. When John approached the cattle, the latter clung to him with an arm around one leg and continued to justify himself. "I made a mistake for the first time, I'm sorry." The cattle company was shocked by their boss's behavior. The cattle kept begging for mercy, "I'll do anything for you." John looks down at everything that's going on and thinks, what the hell is going on here? John takes Scott by the scruff of the neck like a cat to get him back on his feet, while agreeing to their pardon. The main character, turning his head in the direction of the company, says, "Let's talk." Fred's men and Gas and Leo are sitting on the sidelines watching everything and shaking with fear. John sits on the floor with his elbow on his leg, and the rest of the cattle group sits in front of him and listens to his story, while the cattle sit on crates to the side. The cattle are sitting with their backs to the others, drinking water greedily, and John is already finishing his story with the words, "And so I became." After the swaying story of his life, the cattle company briefly repeated the story, as if drowning out all the details for themselves, but they did not understand how he retained consciousness. John sat and stared at nothing and said nothing while the others tried to digest the information. An empty, crumpled water bottle that Scott had been drinking to the tune of "God, this is so romantic" fell to the floor. Scott turned on the crates to face the main character and crossed his arms over his chest and said about sacrificing himself for the sake of his sister and beloved and said, summing up, "This is so cute." Holding up his index finger and looking at John, Scott said, "What if I told you that no one you knew was eaten that day?" John couldn't believe what Scott was saying, and Scott continued, "If they were eaten, they'd be skeleton." Scott closed his eyes and put his hand to his chin, thinking, "If you haven't seen their remains, they're probably still alive." Scott opened his eyes and looked at the protagonist of Or, Maybe. Scott's words unsettled John, and he sat there with his eyes wide open. People were standing in front of the boiling tub and couldn't understand why the others didn't kill the zombies. They looked at the hanging zombies and talked about summoning the boss. One of the zombies broke its rope. Under the cry of people, "Damn!" he fell. The zombie got into the fire for the bath. The zombie's hands and feet were still bound, and it was writhing in the flames, snarling. The smell of burning zombie flesh reached the humans, and they froze. One person drooled and said, "That smell." John says, "The zombies are screaming." Everyone turned and looked at the back of the main character leaving, and Scott asked, "Hey, where are you going?" John stops and turns his head in their direction and says, "Look for them. I must find them." John, walking away, hears the words of Scott, who has hidden his eyes behind his bangs. "Huh? Do you want to search for them alone? In the apocalypse?" Under the word "or," the cattle takes a step to meet the sinful hero. Scott smiled softly. Scott put his arm around John's shoulder as if to hug him, and continued, "Would you like to join us?" The cattle crew was shocked, and one of them shouted, "Hey! What the fuck? Scott turned his head in their direction and gave them an exasperated look. John remembered that the cattle had cut him down earlier, and the cattle turned their heads back to him. Brushing away Scott's hand, the main character continued, "It's true that I do not know why you are catching zombies, but I don't trust you." As John leaves, he continues, "Since we don't trust each other, there's no need for such offers," and Scott looks at his back and notices that he's been turned down. Scott lowered his head so that the shadow of his bangs fell over his eyes, and he looked at the figure of John, who silently left the room. The brute, who exudes an ominous aura, turned towards the person who interrupted his conversation. Twirling his hair around his finger, Scott says angrily, "Who gave you permission to get involved in the conversation?" At the audacity of such an outburst, Scott angrily slapped the person who dared to interrupt their conversation. The terrified people saw this and tried to protect this unfortunate newcomer, who had been under Fred's command for relatively little time. Satisfied with his sudden urge to punch someone, and thus venting his anger and emotions, which had been more than enough for the past few minutes, Scott smiled triumphantly. Scott was very pleased with himself, so he continued to smile and stare at John's back as he walked away. John continued along the corridor in a vague direction, thinking about the cattle incident that had just occurred. Suddenly, John heard some sounds coming from very close to him. The main character, without thinking for a long time, abruptly opened the door of the room from which the mysterious and interesting sounds were coming. There was no limit to the main character's surprise, it was written in his gaze, which expressed nothing but surprise. There was a foul smell in the room, the source of which was the scattered and dismembered corpses, of which there were a lot. Distracted from its not-so-boring task, the unhealthy creature turned its attention to a sudden visitor who dared to interrupt them. Without thinking twice, it attacked John, who continued to stand like a stone with an unreadable expression on his face. On the face of the main character was a lot of emotions, which said that he did not expect to see such a thing. The stench that was in that little room was rapidly making its way into every room in the room, quickly reaching Scott and the other. The man who was standing behind Scott decided to make a joke about the unpleasant smell at his own risk, and the boss rolled his eyes, knowing full well that he was surrounded by a bunch of idiots, nothing more. The red-haired boy, sensing the danger, tensed up in anticipation of the next moves of his opponents, whom he hadn't seen yet. Suddenly, the zombie's hand broke through the wooden door that was behind this guy, and almost grazed his face, passing just a few centimeters away from him. With lightning speed, the zombie bit into the neck of the guy who didn't have precious time to think about the situation. The relatives of the already dead man looked at this with open horror and fear, which they had never experienced before in their lives. Following the first zombie that broke through, as per the scenario, the rest of its relatives came to do what they were meant to do. They frightened cowardly humans who feared for their useless skins, instilling terror that is reflected on their faces. But out of nowhere, an iron pipe appeared in someone's hands and flew at someone's face with great speed. In front of the face of the guy who had said goodbye to his life earlier, blood splattered from the zombie that wanted to kill him. Scott himself came to the rescue of this unfortunate boy, while becoming a world-class hero. John was also trying to deal with the pile of zombies that surrounded him. On the face of the main character was a huge surprise from the realization of what incredible power these creatures possessed. With all his strength, John pushed away the zombie that was trying to harm his life. Tired and distraught, the protagonist looked at his opponent with a proud and victorious look, realizing that his opponent was defeated. The zombie, from such a force of impact, noticeably weakened and sank to the floor, unable to resist the main character anymore. But the other zombies, without wasting their time, also continued to attack John, not giving him a single minute to rest. John, angry with his opponents, tired of the recent fight, became enraged, determined to deal with them once and for all. Clenching his fingers into a fist, the main character swung it with great force to strike. Taking out all his anger and rage, John hit several standing zombies with one punch. The main character noticed out of the corner of his eye the approach of his opponent, who was about to attack him. Zombies with incredible speed sought to kill the main character. But before it has even taken a couple of steps, it flies off in the opposite direction with the same speed. Scott came to John's rescue, killing the crazed zombie with the same metal pipe. John arrived in surprise and openly showed it, he didn't understand Scott's intentions. Scott, on one knee, continued to finish off the zombies. Rising to his starting position, Scott smiled at John, putting all his words and thoughts into this small and necessary gesture. But these were not the last of their defeated opponents. The rest of the zombies continued to advance on the main characters. Scott, pretending to be a great hero and, at the same time, a savior, prepared for a new battle, covering a rather surprised John with his back. With Tuyu's back to John, Scott said something to him. John portrayed the alleged humility of Scott's attitude. He wants to tell Scott something really important, something that's been bothering him for quite some time, and Scott freezes in anticipation of the question. But all of a sudden, John and Scott hear someone yelling and yelling coming their way. These were the survivors of Fred and Scott's people, who were also running away from the crazed zombies, rushing to help the main characters. Because John didn't get a chance to say what he was going to say, he looked annoyed and furious. Scott quickly took control of the situation, including the full and uttering complete nonsense. And the zombies do not wait and continue to advance on people, showing their readiness for battle with all their appearance. Now Scott and John will fight side by side, helping each other to survive. The surviving humans are running towards the main characters to help them deal with so many zombies. Zombies surround the main characters on both sides, ready to attack. John is determined and ready for a new battle, knowing that today he will not remain a loser, because he has a small team that will help him in the event of a threat to his life. Meanwhile, someone is trying to make a hole in the wall to get out of the chaos that surrounded the survivors. It was none other than Leo himself, frantically trying to save his worthless life. The survivors hovered near the room, hearing very strange noises coming from it. It seemed that there was no end to the zombies. There were too many of them. They continued to attack with the same rage and horror. But John was much stronger than a bunch of these freaks who were unknowingly going to their deaths, and he swept them away with one of his strong blows. But the zombies did not give up, continuing to fight the main character. One of the zombies still managed to jump and bite into John's neck. John stared blankly at the zombie that had attempted to kill him. But then his face twisted in anger and rage. John grabbed the insane zombie by the hair and started pulling it away from his neck. With all his strength, John tossed it aside, marveling at the zombie's audacity. John then jumps and kicks the zombie in the face, but it continues to scream. But before he can kick him, John stops abruptly, his face showing complete surprise. The main character has a question: who could stop him from such an action, which brings a lot of pleasure. Lowering his head, the main character sees his hands locked in a lock, in order to stop him. Turning his head, John notices the white hair that belongs to Scott, who has a death grip on the main character. The main characters shout at each other, trying to convince each other of the opposite things. Scott firmly holds John's back, wrapping his arms around him, blocking John's ability to make even the slightest movement. The iron pipe, which was abruptly thrown by Scott from the scene he saw, lies not far from them, while the main character continues to hold John down. But even so, the zombies continued to attack Fred's people. No one could stop this chaos, there were too many of them. Michael, realizing the danger of the situation, hastened to warn people that they could not cope. Because Scott was only distracted for a second, a zombie suddenly appeared behind him and was about to attack. "Holy shit," Scott cursed, looking at his opponent with a surprised look. But just in time, a hand grabbed the head of the crazed zombie from Scott. None other than John hurried to help Scott, looking him straight in the eye with a look full of positive emotions. Scott was taken aback by the meaningful look from the other man. John squeezed the zombie's head with incredible force, preventing the zombie from being able to move, to hurt Scott, who in turn seemed to have a lot of emotions on his face at once. Scott's face was pressed against John's shoulder, causing his face to twist. And behind them, the zombie's skull cracked with only seconds left. John's face showed the determination of what he was going to do to save Scott's life. Pressing as hard as possible on the skull of his opponent, John tried to kill the zombie, which had blood visible, which indicated that it was about to be defeated. Scott lay on the floor, trying to process what had happened. Michael and the blonde boy stared at the people in front of them in disbelief, silently praying that the cattle were all right. Michael watched Scott's legs loom out of the cave, preparing himself for a better outcome. The cattle screamed, slightly shocked by what they had experienced a few seconds earlier. Scott stared at John, trying to piece together a puzzle in his head, not understanding the intentions and motives of the man opposite him. John looked at Scott with a warm smile as he considered his actions. Out of breath, Michael and the blonde guy ran into the room to make sure Scott was safe and sound. Michael asked the blonde guy to help him so that he wouldn't stand like a rock. But suddenly, he was captured by the same zombie that had tried to kill Scott a few minutes earlier. John stepped on his foot with great force to prevent an attack on Michael. John looked at the zombie with sadness, realizing that only recently it was a healthy person who probably had a family, friends, a job. Michael understood the essence of his thoughts behind, and the blonde guy recognized this zombie as his father. The crazed zombie didn't understand what it was doing, so it grunted and tried to get up to continue fighting. But suddenly he was gagged with a bottle of gasoline, which was stuffed into his mouth, which made him not understand this action, looked at everyone with a blank look in his eyes. John looked at him one last time, thinking of something else. Suddenly, John lit a match, which instantly flared up and illuminated the cave with a dim light. John thought back to a conversation he'd had with the zombie long ago, when it was a healthy person. Realizing that he is doing everything right, John slowly puts a burning match to the mouth of his old friend, who has a bottle of a highly flammable substance in his mouth. All around are consumed by flames that mercilessly take these creatures from the world of the living. In the midst of the fire, a man's face is visible. It expresses the horror that will now remain on his face forever. John, Scott, Michael, and the blonde guy look at the fire that consumes this room and takes these creatures with it. The blonde guy, realizing that he has lost the most precious and valuable thing that he has, without holding back emotions, begins to cry from the accumulated resentment and pain. Scott just stares at the fire he wanted to start, which would have killed Fred's men in the process. John looks with regret and sorrow at what he did a few seconds earlier. The smoke from the fire continues to reach for the sky, as well as the souls that he took with him, leaving no chance of survival for the already dead zombies. The characters continue to look at it, perhaps each of them is thinking the same thing right now. With a mental goodbye to everyone, John turns to face Scott. Scott really wanted to help and mentally support the passing John, who closed his eyes so as not to show even more emotion. Scott looked pointedly at John, trying to find words of gratitude and encouragement. John kept walking, listening to every word Scott said to him. Seeing no reaction from John, Scott decided to ask him the most important question. Scott's eyes were determined, eager to understand what John wanted from him. When John heard the question that was addressed to him, he stopped, not believing what he was hearing, and replayed the possible answers in his head, so he did not hurry to turn around and answer Scott. In a few miserable seconds, Scott mentally collapsed 7 times, suffered 3 strokes, cut out his tongue and managed to say goodbye to his life, not understanding why he blurted it out right now. John said nothing to the eager questioner, but looked at him with the most charming and sincere smile he could muster. And John doesn't calculate how hard he shoved Scott in the stomach, as if translating the entire dialogue into nothing more than a joke, thereby diverting this conversation to the future. The force of the blow made Scott twist in half, a small trickle of blood spurting from his mouth, and his eyes were full of a worldwide problem, which puzzled John a little. Michael and the blonde guy were surprised by this outburst and visibly worried about Scott's condition. John grabbed a surprised Scott's arm to help him. He then slung it over his shoulder so that he could continue to carry it on his own without causing any discomfort to Scott, whom he had nearly crippled in the last few seconds. Scott was pleased with this outburst, but he looked at John with a smile and calmness. But suddenly, for everyone, the car that could safely leave this territory also caught fire, making it impossible for them to move. No doubt everyone was confused and surprised by this, so they just stared at the car. We have nothing to leave on, we are doomed, no one will help us, we will die, the blonde guy panicked, realizing the absurdity of what had happened. Unexpectedly for everyone, Scott, who was hanging on to John's shoulder, managed to slap the little guy in the face, shouting at the same time that he has no right to throw such phrases around. Michael tried to defuse the situation by calming Scott down and covering the boy with his back, who did not expect such a turn of events, roared again, and John accordingly tried to calm the man who screamed and screamed, cursing the little one. But out of nowhere, everyone heard Leo's snide chuckle as he made a mock smile. Everyone abruptly turned their attention to the new member of this idol, switching their attention to Leo without fail. He twirled the keys to the car that belonged to him on his finger, hinting that there was a way out of the situation right in his hand. Scott looked at Leo with a certain disdain and disbelief for his person, thinking that this could be another setup. Leo slapped his forehead, marveling at this caution, but time waits for no one. If he didn't hurry right now, then soon all that would be left of him would be his name. Leo called out to everyone present, asking for help, clasping his hands together, showing them that he needed them now more than anything else. Finding the car that belonged to Leo, he inserted the key and turned it. Wiping the beads of sweat from his face, he realized that the car wasn't working properly, or he was running out of gas. After looking at the other cars, Leo tried to think of something new to help them get out of there. Adjusting the collar of his shirt to show his excitement, he announced to everyone that he was out of gas. The group looked at Leo with a very unreadable look. They were mentally exhausted and very tired. Scott, with not very good intentions, approaches Leo and gives him a look full of anger and fatigue. But suddenly, Scott's eyes fall on something that will help solve his little emotional problem. Scott slaps Leo across the face with all his might, sending him flying into a small motorcycle that was parked nearby. Michael is supportive of Scott's actions, while the blonde guy is worried about Leo's condition, due to his young age. Scott and Leo yell at each other, taking out all their hate and dislike. Scott and Leo are distracted from their conflict by the sound of chains rattling not far from them. While the two of them argued and argued, John found a solution to their problem by driving a bus. Everyone looks around at John's bus, and Leo gets on first. Leo looks inside the bus to make sure it's completely clean and there are no signs of zombies inside. Finding nothing suspicious, Leo, Michael, and the blonde guy board the bus in dead silence. Michael and the blonde guy are trying to keep quiet, so as not to continue the conflict that recently occurred with Scott. Leo is noticeably worried about the people who are in the same salon with him. John continues to stand on the street and looks mysteriously at the moon, which appeared only recently due to the fact that the clouds are finally clearing. John looks off into the distance, at the horizon, and thinks about something else. Scott, who is also standing outside the bus, expresses his gratitude for finding a quick solution and saving him, distracting John from his thoughts. John smiles at this and shows that he's doing it all out of good intentions. Scott leaves John with a mysterious smile and enters the bus. Then we are shown other events and we see that Will is running as fast as he can, trying to escape from the zombie that is catching up with him. The unconscious creature continues to chase after the guy in order to commit lynching over the person. Will runs into a trap that he himself invented and built to fight such unhealthy creatures. Behind Will, a whole crowd of zombies is chasing after him, trying to catch up with him and kill him. Will falls to the ground, showing the zombie that he is defenseless and unarmed, so that the zombie woman will quickly jump after him and do what she was chasing after him all this time. Zombie does exactly as Will originally intended. She did exactly as 100 others before her did. Will smiles at the genius and resourcefulness of his well-thought-out plan, which will help get rid of at least a handful of zombies. The zombie raises its hand to strike to kill the person who is lying a few centimeters away from it. At this point, Will jumps out of the way to prevent the zombie from killing him, while the zombie falls to the ground. Will looks at the zombies surrounding him with hatred, not understanding how humanity could have come to this. A crowd of zombies, absolutely not understanding anything, go to their target, but they are deeply mistaken, thinking that in the next moment they will kill him. With one wave of his hand, the hero strikes a match and throws it on the ground, which is previously doused with gasoline. All zombies in an instant find themselves in flames that will take their souls. Will looks at the fruit of his labors, at the fire, and at the once healthy people who are now being burned alive. The human settlement Will lives with thanks him for the work he's done and the well-thought-out plan. Confused zombies continue to scream from the fire. All the zombies were burned alive in the fire, leaving behind ashes and clothes. In the kitchen, someone's stew of soup is being cooked, which is about to start boiling, mesmerizing with its delicious aroma. The village chief pours soup and pieces of meat into a bowl. Fred, with an unhealthy smile on his face, drags a little girl by the hand, who is crying and struggling with all her might. Fred and the prefect are talking among themselves, saying something about a good day. In the dungeon are other very frightened people who do not understand the reason for their stay here. Fred kicks the front door of the dungeon to get in. Mothers hold their babies close, and they look tired and scared. People are very scared, do not understand the essence of what is happening and the reason for the visit. Fred drags the little girl to a bowl of stew, which she in turn resists. The girl is forcibly stuffed with a human organ, thus conducting an experiment on whether it is possible to eat it. The girl, overcome with disgust, tries to chew what was forcibly stuffed into her. Fred and the prefect are watching the girl's reaction closely. While continuing to cry and scream loudly, she was still able to swallow this organ. Fred and the other people are happy about the success of the experiment. This stew is poured into bowls to feed other people. All the people threw themselves on the food, which is so lacking in this difficult time. The girl continues to cry, and is not fully aware of what is happening in the world right now. Thank you all for watching. If you want the second part to come out, then put likes and write a comment. Bye.